One of the amendments that voters will be casting a ballot on this November has to do with who is allowed to vote here in the Commonwealth. Sheila is asking, have our voter registration files been cleaned so that dead people have been removed, people who no longer live in Kentucky are no longer able to vote here, and non-citizens cannot vote? Well, here is Victor Puente with the answer to that good question.
When it comes to non-citizens, they're already not allowed to vote in Kentucky. To register to vote in the Commonwealth, the State Board of Elections says you must be a U.S. citizen and a Kentucky resident for at least 28 days before the election. They specifically say that non-U.S. citizens, including U.S. nationals, do not qualify. You also have to be 18 by the general election, not be a convicted felon, or if you're convicted of a felony, you have to have had your voting rights restored. You have to have not been judged mentally incompetent in a court of law and have your voting rights removed, and not claim the right to vote outside of Kentucky. As for cleaning the voter rolls, the Secretary of State's office says that is an ongoing process. The most recent numbers from his office show that since Michael Adams took office, there have been 416,870 voters removed from those rolls. They tell me that 233,000 of those were people who were dead. Others include people who have moved, people with felony convictions, and some who deregistered. If you have a good question, just email us. Goodquestion@wkyt.com. I'll see you on WKYT Mornings.